Now, Israel could launch a military attack on Iran within the next year. That's according to John Bolton, a former U.S. ambassador to the UN. And he's now in our Washington studio with RT's Aliona Minkowski. Aliona, hello there. So over to you.
Thank you. Well, a nuclear-armed Iran is something many countries don't want to see, but despite condemnations, threats of sanctions, so far nothing has been able to stand in their path towards nuclear development. And the policy of the new U.S. administration has so far been to extend an open hand of diplomacy. As an open hand of diplomacy. But what about the country that many people say is so far the most at risk? Well, former Ambassador John Bolton to the UN and current fellow at the American Enterprise Institute is saying that Israel could very likely attack Iran by the end of this year. Even though the U.S. has so far been trying to talk them out of it, he's saying this also might be the only thing that could stop them from further developing their nuclear program. Thank you for joining me. Now, a military strike is really a heavy deal. Are you saying that Israel has no choice in this?
Well, I don't think they've made up their minds definitively one way or the other, but I think they've looked at now approaching 7 years of failed diplomacy, first by the Europeans, then by the Security Council, during which time Iran has simply advanced its nuclear program further and further. They don't see any prospect of successful diplomacy with the current regime in Iran, and given that a nuclear Iran would be an existential threat to the state of Israel, I think they've got to come to the point of decision, and fairly quickly.
But what about a retaliation from Iran? How large scale could this really be?
You know, the Iranians have threatened all kinds of things, closing the Straits of Hormuz, cutting off oil exports. All of that, I think, is very unlikely. I think the most likely response, although you never can tell with Iran, but the most likely response would be to unleash Hezbollah and Hamas to attack Israel. So that's obviously a very significant, complicating factor in the Israeli decision-making process.
Exactly. Could we see a full-scale war then with allies from both sides coming into it? I mean, how large really could the consequences of this be?
Again, one can't be certain. Nobody wants to be in this position. The fact, though, is that so much diplomacy has been tried, all of it has failed, that we're down now to fairly unattractive options. And as unattractive as the use of military force against Iran's nuclear program would be, it's even more unattractive to consider an Iran with nuclear weapons. So from Israel's point of view, given that it's a very small country, given that the President Ahmadinejad has repeatedly called for Israel to be wiped off the map, and given that it would only take 2 or 3 nuclear weapons to do just that, I don't think the Israelis are going to sit back. A nuclear holocaust, a repeat of the killing of 6 million Jews in World War II, is not something Israel will simply wait for.
But this is a very risky move by Israel. Currently, their relationship with the U.S. is probably the worst that it's been in years. A lot of people are saying that. So would they go on and do this without the U.S. backing? What would the U.S.'s role be?
Well, I personally believe the U.S. should assist Israel. I think if Israel does attack, the United States is going to get blamed for it anyway. And I think the worst outcome is for Israel to strike the nuclear program in Iran and fail to destroy it, or at least set it back for 3 to 5 years. But I think the Obama administration, as you rightly say, has a very bad relationship with Israel, probably as bad as any since the Suez Canal crisis of 1956. I think they're putting enormous pressure on Israel not to take military action, and I think it's a further very complicating factor for the Israelis. It simply underlines why the decision to use military force is neither easy nor a smooth road.
Right, and using military force might then put more pressure on the U.S. too, let's say with their troops in Iraq. Then how would perhaps, the Shiites, how might they endanger the U.S. troops, and then the U.S. troops would have to get involved somehow?
Well, there is a risk that Iran would retaliate by increasing terrorist attacks against American and other coalition forces in Iraq. You can't discount that possibility. I think it's unlikely, however, because if they did materially step up their attacks on American forces, Iran would risk direct American retaliation against the country.
I have to wrap it up there, but very scary thought. Could Israel attack Iran, and could then we see a much larger conflict? Thank you, and back to Moscow.
All right, Aliona, thank you very much indeed for that interview, and we'll see you later.